What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. is going to be fighting Anderson Silva, the longtime UFC Middleweight champ, and in my opinion is the second greatest mixed martial artist ever after John Jones. You know, I don't like this fight at all. I'm going to watch it. I've been a huge Anderson Silva fan, since like 2005, 2006. And I've watched Julio Cesar Chavez Jr.'s like whole career. He was a promising, prospect. They were kind of bringing him along slow. He won some of the lesser titles. He won like the WBC Latino super welterweight title versus Cuello. This was like in 2009. Then he started winning like the equivalent of a WBC like interim-ish belt, not one of the major titles. And then a couple years later, like 2011, he won the WBC Middleweight belt. And then he kept that title for a while. So like, he retained it, I think, 4 times. No, he had lost it on his 4th title defense. He had won 3, the last of which was against Andy Lee, who at the time was a really formidable fighter, and he stopped Andy Lee. And Andy Lee at the time was trained by Emmanuel Stewart. There was like a big deal about Chavez Jr. refusing to take the post-fight like drug test. Emmanuel Stewart, the late great trainer Emmanuel Stewart, was very vocal about his displeasure and how that was handled, and the fact that Stewart believed that Chavez Jr. was getting away with taking stuff that he wasn't supposed to be taking, and there was no accountability. So, Chavez Jr. for a while was looking like a wrecking ball. He obviously had the physical tools. He was a really big 154 guy. And then he goes up to middleweight, still a big middleweight. Not only was he like 6 feet tall, but just frame-wise, shoulder to shoulder, across the back, like he was a big boy. And so he was terrorizing fighters for a while. But even in Julio Cesar Chavez Jr.'s prime, say like 2010 to 2012, you got the impression that the guy was cutting corners, that he didn't have the best workout habits. Later down the road, Freddie Roach, refused to even train him because of how much he was the type to blow off training, and just had kind of a more of a pedal to the metal in the party lane type of lifestyle. He liked to smoke a lot of herb, and it wouldn't be so bad if he was just blowing trees. I mean, look, I'm wearing a Yes t-shirt, but it's the blowing weight and blowing off practice that has kind of been his undoing. So he had the title for a while, finally loses it in 2012 versus one of the best middleweights and kind of one of the best fighters around those weight classes at the time, Sergio Martinez. He beat Chavez by winning just about all of the early to middle rounds, and then Chavez almost took him out in the 12th round. Sergio Martinez was holding on for dear life, held on, got dropped. When Sergio Martinez starts smiling, he's in trouble. He's either having a really good time and winning by a mile in there when he's smiling, or he's about to get finished, which, the only 2 times we've seen him on the brink, once in this fight, which he did still survive with the victory, he being Sergio Martinez, and against, Miguel Cotto a little down the line. Basically, Sergio Martinez's last fight before retiring, and then more recently coming back eventually. But that was like the end of Sergio Martinez, the bulk of his career. And both times you can kind of see there's a smile that he gives that indicates, yeah, I'm in trouble. And so he loses the title there. And then ever since then, he actually had a very competitive fight. I thought his opponent, Brian Vera, got robbed in their first fight, but Chavez Jr. got the decision. They had a rematch. Chavez fought a lot better in the rematch, won that one, so he was rewarded with 2 wins. I thought he only deserved the second one. But even in these fights with like Brian Vera, after the loss of Sergio Martinez, he was already fluctuating in weight to where they would agree upon one weight, then like the week before the fight or the week of the fight, they say, oh no, I've got to fight up here. Can you meet me up here? And it's kind of been that since. And so after the split, or no, he won them both against Brian Vera, but performance-wise, it felt like a split. He fights true light heavyweight Andres Fonfara, because again, Chavez Jr. is starting to blow middleweight, blow 168. Now he's fighting Andres Fonfara, and he gets finished. He got finished in the 9th round against Fonfara. And then in the past 5 years, he's kind of been a win some, lose some kind of guy. The 3 losses that he's had out of his last 7 fights have been against Canelo Alvarez, Daniel Jacobs, and then Mario Cazares. So in fairness, he's been trying to stage a bit of a comeback, just being that he fought twice in 2019. After not fighting for 2 years, he returns, fights twice in 2019, and then twice in 2020. And now he's fighting a UFC legend, Anderson Silva, who was just ahead of his time. I mean, it got to a point during his reign as middleweight champion to where you would tune in to his title defense just totally oblivious to how he might finish his next opponent. You know, when he captured the UFC title in only his 2nd UFC fight, he fought Chris Lieben in his UFC debut, but he fights Rich Franklin. And then he kind of makes the Muay Thai clinch an iconic thing because it just looked like Franklin was trapped in this vice grip behind his neck and was being led and steered around the ring. Couldn't do anything about it. And Silva just punished him with knees to the body until he finally went up top to the face, brought the knee high. And just his level of technical mastery, but it was also his deception, his timing. And I don't want to get into the cliche of talking about angles and, feints and dips, but he was doing it all. But he was doing it in a transitional time in the UFC where people were just starting to become true holistic mixed martial artists as opposed to specialists in their respective fields. Anderson Silva, was losing every round of his 12th title defense or something. When he fought Chael Sonnen the first time, Chael Sonnen came into the fight talking so much trash, and to Chael's credit, took him down in round 1, 2, 3, 4. By the time we get to 5, we're thinking, oh my God, is Chael Sonnen about to take the title from the Spider, Anderson Silva? And then with a minute and a half or a minute left on the clock, he gets him in an arm triangle from the guard position. He was being taken down the entire fight and not badly damaged. Chael was just staying busy enough to win every round. But Silva pulls off a submission in the last minute of the fight, and it was almost straight out of a storybook, Seriously, you'd be hard pressed to find a movie, a sports movie that has that type of drama. And Silva finished Vitor Belfort with a front kick. It was oh my God. And Vitor Belfort, former champ in multiple organizations, just one of the most electrifying stand-up mixed martial artists in mixed martial arts history. He was a UFC OG. He came in at UFC 7, 8 or something and just obliterated Tank Abbott and has had a storied career since. But when he and Anderson Silva had their showdown, at some point of the fight, Silva leans forward and then calmly just sits back and throws a not even a fast front kick. It got there quickly. It wasn't slow, but it was almost the relaxation when Silva is doing his thing is one of the most remarkable things about it. The fact that he's just kind of poker face, he's rolled out of bed and just front kicked Vitor Belfort in the face. He just rolled out of bed and, took 2 steps back as former champ. Forrest Griffin is throwing punches and lunging at him. Silva's just sitting back and then on his off foot kind of jab hand puts Griffin down for the 3rd time and finishes him. He caught James Irwin, hard-hitting James Irwin, who finished Houston Alexander, who was a devastatingly hard hitter himself. James Irwin comes in the beginning of the fight against Anderson Silva, and this is one of Anderson Silva's 3 step-ups to 205. The first time was against James Irwin. Second time was that fight against Forrest Griffin, and then he did it later in his career, post-prime, against Daniel Cormier on short notice once John Jones tested positive. But in 2008, Silva goes up and flirts with light heavyweight against James Irwin. James Irwin comes in, throws a body kick. Silva, in one motion, catches the kick with one hand, knocks him to the floor, flat on the ground with his free hand. Again, he catches it and shoots. I think he caught it with the right, shot the left hand. Either way, it was in one fluid motion. And sometimes you would see somebody maybe catch a kick, but they would catch it in a way where, if anything, they would catch it with two hands. And, then you just have an exposed chin because now both of your hands are occupied. No. Silva was so expert and so surgical with his destruction. It was, I forgot how the person coined it, like a symphony of violence. I think that's what he called it. Like, this was like a long time ago when Silva was like fighting Nate Marquardt in 2007. Like I said, he caught that James Irwin body kick with one hand, dropped him with the free hand, and then just calmly walks up to him. It's like almost like he's just looking at his kill, but he just walks up to him, throws like three just deadly accurate punches. And I get the feeling that although Silva's not looked at as a devastatingly hard puncher in the way that, like, obviously Francis Ngannou now, before that, Rumble Johnson, Yoel Romero, Chuck Liddell, he's not that type of a puncher with that type of a reputation, but he's so balanced and so technically sound and so explosive that his punch is actually a little bit underrated when you see what he's done with a lot of these people. By the time he was finished with his title defenses before finally getting stopped by Chris Weidman, he was just sitting there with his knees bent, with his hands down, just calm, looking at, Yushin Okami, looking at Stephan Bonner, and then just pot-shotting. But with his pot shots, sometimes they were fight-finishing pot shots. Sometimes they would just put the guy on his ass. Silva would take a step back, put his hands on his hips, invite the guy back up. Look, there is so much ill stuff. I mean, you can't even get into it. But this was a reign that lasted, at least in the UFC, from 2006, that's when he beat Rich Franklin for the title, all the way to 2012 when he defended against Stephan Bonner and TKO'd him with like knees to the body and then punches. So this is like a 6 to 7 year title reign. Imagine that in today's context. I mean, we've seen it with John Jones, obviously, but aside from that, in GSP, where do you get that type of domination? But since that, Silva had 2 wins out of his last 8 fights. But one of those was turned to a no contest versus Nick Diaz, and that's where we had gotten to. A former 170 guy is up there at 185 testing Anderson Silva and surviving 5 rounds. That fight was later ruled a no contest. But look, the other fights, the 2 versus Weidman, and then against Michael Bisping, which, Silva almost stopped him but lost, and then Daniel Cormier, you can almost forgive him for that one, short notice. But then he beats Derek Brunson in a fight that I thought, watching the fight, Derek Brunson deserved a close decision. It felt like a draw-ish type of fight. Harder to get draws in the UFC where there, 5 rounds instead of boxing has 12, so it's easy to get the 6-6. But Silva was awarded that win, and then loses a 3-round competitive decision versus Israel Adesanya, the current middleweight champ, and then loses via TKO leg kick versus Jared Cannonier. And this is different than when Silva tried to kick Weidman in their second fight and then, broke his leg in half. That was one of the worst MMA nights of my fanship viewing. Oh my goodness, that was horrible. And then Silva just got finished by Uriah Hall in his last UFC fight. This was on Halloween of 2020, just a few months ago. So it should be noted that, even in Silva's prime, he would always, talk about wanting to fight Roy Jones Jr. in a boxing match. This is prime Roy Jones, because he had already been finished by Tarver and Glenn Johnson, but he was still Roy Jones Jr. and was still fighting. And you could tell that Silva, had a lot of love and admiration for the great Roy Jones Jr. So he'd always wanted to box him. It was just one of these weird things. Not as weird as the whole Steven Seagal thing. We're not going to get into that folklore of the guidance that Steven Seagal might have or might not have provided to Anderson Silva. But Anderson Silva's a really unique, odd dude. But he'd always wanted to fight Roy Jones in a boxing match, so that didn't quite happen, at least not yet. We just saw Roy in the exhibition with Mike Tyson. So Silva is fighting Chavez Jr. And I think that Chavez Jr., if he comes in with his, normal I'm coming to win mindset, should finish Anderson Silva. Anderson Silva, he's a mixed martial artist, not a boxer. He mixes in a lot of technical things. If it was just the hands, he would be in his prime, he would have been probably the best, if not one of the best, in the UFC just with the hands. But against a boxer who's gone his whole career using nothing but hands. He's just not that good. Now, he's naturally a little bigger than Chavez. He fought at 185 throughout his career, he being Anderson Silva. Chavez, at one point when he was a young pro, fought 154. Then he fought 160 middleweight. In boxing, 160 is middleweight. In UFC, it's 185. I get it. But, Chavez Jr. at his best was 160, maybe 168, but then 175. Now you're fighting Silva, who's a 185 guy. Now, that just tells me Chavez Jr. barely has to train, to make weight for this one. But if he's coming and really trying to fight, Chavez Jr. is a durable fighter. He naturally has a chin that's resilient. His dad is Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., for God's sakes. So he could take a punch. That was never his problem. And he could hit hard as hell, hard as a bull, at least in the weight classes that he was competing in for most of his better days in boxing. And look, Chavez Jr. just fought Danny Jacobs like a year ago. And he gave Daniel Jacobs, currently a viable, championship contender in boxing. Chavez Jr. just fought him a year ago at 168, not at, 185 or wherever he's going to fight, wherever this exhibition is going to take place. But Chavez Jr. shouldn't have a problem, not only beating Anderson Silva, but if he wanted to stop Anderson Silva, I could see him having Silva in trouble early and landing clean shots. Look, one of the most noticeable things of Silva's decline was his lack of volume throughout the fight. Now, he's always been pretty selective. He was never just a high-volume, rah-rah guy. He'd always pick his spots, but he just seemed less able to, at the perfect timing, which is what he was a master of, timing, he wasn't able to pull the trigger in the same devastating way that he used to. And if you can't pull the trigger, I don't see how you're going to deal with somebody who's going to be up in your grill, throwing hard punches in the way that Julio Jr. is going to be throwing. So, maybe Julio lets Silva off the hook and lets him survive the fight. He doesn't need to. I think he can stop Silva. So Anderson Silva's almost a 3-1 underdog, right? As it stands. Silva's 45 years old, and Chavez Jr. is 35 years old. They're about the same height. Again, Silva's only won one MMA fight in the last 8 years. So I don't care whether they're fighting 3 rounds, 6 rounds. I hope it's 3 rounds for Anderson Silva's sake. I don't want to see him take any more damage, man. Like he didn't have to take the damage that he took in his last few fights. It wasn't a ton of damage. Silva wasn't somebody who was just getting his lights put out fight after fight, like you see some people hanging around too long and suffering that fate. That wasn't Silva, but just, his legs were breaking, if anything. And then, Uriah Hall stopped him recently. But, the faculties that Silva still has, you want him to keep, especially for as storied and legendary a career he's had in the UFC. I hope he doesn't need the money. But please, let me know what you think about this Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. versus Anderson the Spider Silva fight. I don't like this for Silva. Chavez Jr. is, if nothing else, a pretty dangerous guy. And he gave Daniel Jacobs hell for the first few rounds before that fight, before he suffered a cut and the fight was stopped. But yeah, for those first couple rounds, Daniel Jacobs was new to the 168-pound division, but he was kind of bum rushed, and it took him a while to navigate and figure it out and start to be able to counter punch effectively. Because Chavez could get after it. I expect him to be all over Anderson Silva, who again hasn't been showing the volume and the energy that you would want in a fighter right now. Again, 45 years old, super low volume. Chavez, I expect, especially a fast starter, who keeps on coming forward. You know what I mean? I don't see what Silva's gonna do to gain and to keep Chavez Jr.'s respect. He's gonna have to let his hands go and stay busy, and that I just haven't seen a ton of that from Silva lately. But again, maybe his saving grace is that he is a naturally bigger guy. We'll see. I don't think it's happening. I'm going Chavez Jr. here. But yeah, please leave your comments in the comments, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.